Hello, I'm Janice Karen, the Director of Integration Technologies at the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium, excuse me, or MHTC. I run our Data Governance Collaborative, also known as the DGC. We start each of our weekly meetings with a series of industry quick updates to learn about new and proposed regulations, laws, standards, industry initiatives, and other activity. Join us for this week's updates. If you'll go ahead and move to the first update, Dave. So we're going to start with a new HITAC report on ONC standards. This report was actually finished in September, but it was just publicly released last week. This is required every 3 years moving forward as part of sort of the oversight of how the standards process is working at ONC. And basically what they're doing is they're looking at a variety of standards that are used in different ways in different programs at ONC and recommending either that they're maintained as is, that they're phased out with a replacement, or phased out without a replacement. Excuse me. And so for this report, they actually didn't recommend that anything was phased out without replacement. And they made, this is only a sampling of the recommendations they made, but some of the things that are more pertinent or more interesting for the type of stuff that we focus on. So for maintain as is, the administrative gender value set, the big one is fire, continuing to use fire Rev 4, but they did recommend that ONC starts planning for a future upgrade path. And the reason they recommended maintain as is that they wanted a long glide path to move to fire, presumably Rev 5. And so that makes sense. To remind those of you who may not have been on calls where we discussed it, in general, fire does not require backwards compatibility. So whenever there's a big upgrade, it's definitely more of a churn than you might see for other APIs where some level of backwards compatibility is a requirement. And then also in that category is data segmentation for privacy, which is sort of the tagging mechanism that some groups use for consent tracking. But most of the things on the list, they recommended to phase out with replacement. And in general, that was basically moved to the next version of something. So there was a recommendation that all of the US CDI version 1 requirements and the corresponding version of US Core, which often isn't explicitly mentioned, but used as a stand-in for US CDI, that those get replaced with newer versions in tandem. So that presumably they're recommending, at some point they'll move to US CDI version 2, and at the same time they'll move to the US Core version that's equivalent to US CDI version 2. Not equivalent, but used in lieu of US CDI version 2. And then they made a recommendation for almost all of the standard code sets that those also get moved to newer versions. They also were talking about replacing race and ethnicity requirements with newer CDC versions. And there was also some talk in general of OMB upgrades, but that they're not set yet, so that wasn't explicitly called out as something to do. They also talked about replacing, upgrading the version of Smart on Fire, and then also upgrading the quality reporting document architecture. So you can read more about the specifics of all of these and some additional things at the link here. Any questions or thoughts? All right, then let's move on to the next item on the list. So CMS has released some sample formats for the hospital price transparency machine readable files. These are not requirements, you don't have to use them, but they've basically put out 3 samples, what they're calling the tall CSV and the wide CSV with accompanying documentation, and then also a JSON schema. And so there's no, you can use these formats and not use these. You can use CSV and not use this particular format for CSV. You can use JSON and not use this particular schema, but they've put those out there as samples for people who are saying, I don't know what format to use. What do I do? What do I do? There's also on the same page that they put these on, a whole bunch of other resources. There's a fact that was last updated on November 1st of this year. I know several quick references, guides, and checklists to help you understand the requirements or what you have to do. And then there's also slides from a June 2021 webinar, not a recording, but just the slides, sort of outlining the basic requirements. So all of that is on this page here. If you scroll down, it actually starts with some other stuff at the top of the page. And then there's a heading that says resources, and everything I mentioned on this slide is underneath that resources heading. Any questions or comments or thoughts here?
There's also Project Clarity on the commercial side, which is trying to promulgate a standard format framework for price transparency for hospitals around, the 50 most, I think they're starting with 10, but ultimately they want to get to 500 of the most common services that hospitals provide, where they combine professional fees, facility fees, other associated costs that a patient might incur through their insurance, and as a result, what they might pay out of pocket. So they're moving in parallel, but maybe not on the same path, but they're probably going to converge pretty soon, I would suspect.
Well, that project is actually specifically looking at the no surprises requirements.
Right.
And this is a slightly different program, although in theory they would hopefully converge at some point. So this particular program actually specifies, they don't tell you how to define them, true, so it's not the same thing, but the hospital price transparency actually specifies certain services that have to be included. And so I believe it's 300 that have to be, well, you have to have everything in the machine readable, and then there are 300. So the rules are a little bit different, but your point's still valid in that there's likely to be, there hopefully would be convergence, because you wouldn't want to define things differently depending on where you're putting the information or how you're distributing it. But any other thoughts or comments or questions? All right, well, let's go on to the next one then. So HHS has released a notice of proposed rulemaking for HIPAA changes related to pharmacy that were part of from NCPDP. And they're planning to make updates for retail pharmacy standards for electronic transactions around claims, encounter information, plan eligibility, referral certification, and coordination of benefits. So there's an overview on the CMS website there, and then a link to the full NPRM below that for those of you who might be interested in this. Any comments or thoughts or questions?
Do you have a sense, Janice, of what some of those updates are for things like claims and encounter information? What is that when they say updates to retail pharmacy standards for electronic transactions? Are those enhanced EDI capabilities? What is it that they're looking to achieve there?
It's not clear to me. I believe these are primarily EDI transactions. So yes, most likely enhanced EDI transactions, but as far as what they're trying to enhance or what the specific goals are, I'm not sure. I have not read the entire NPRM yet. And I don't know if Dave, you have any thoughts on this? Had a chance?
Yeah, I'll just mention that the NCPDP is the standard for the electronic exchange of pharmacy-related information. So every so often, maybe not every year, but every so often, they'll publish new updates to the transaction standards. And if you look at them, some of them may include things like additional information supported in claims for different, specific scenarios, depending on what it may be. And typically it's industry-related changes for things like inclusion of telemedicine codes, for example, is one of the ones. Obviously, that doesn't really pertain to pharmacy, but those are the types of updates usually that are included.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions or comments here? All right, let's move on to the next one. So this just came out late yesterday. I have only read the overview and not the full report, not the full plan yet. But basically, they're looking at a many-pronged approach to addressing health equity, and there were several. It is definitely very data focused. And so two of the areas, there's some other things they're planning to do, but two of the main areas that they talked about were prioritizing data collection, specifically calling out things on this slide, like trying to figure out what new data elements should be collected and are important to address disparities, specifically collecting race and ethnicity data, requiring it when people enroll in Medicare Advantage plans, collecting, SDOH and social needs data whenever for everyone enrolled in alternate payment models, and adding new standard demographic and SDOH patient assessment data elements for post-acute settings. And there definitely was a little bit of a focus on post-acute. There were some other portions of a plan that talked about things they wanted to do in post-acute care settings. But on the data front, in addition to the data collection, they also want to provide more regular access to disaggregated data. They do this thing called data snapshots where they periodically publish de-identified and data on a certain topic with quite a bit of data that comes from Medicare plans or sometimes Medicaid. And so they didn't specify in the overview if there were specific types of data snapshots that they were looking to provide that they're not providing now, but they're definitely implied that they would be doing more of that. And then also specific reporting on demographics and a handful of specific SDOH factors that they outline in the overview. So this blog post here is the overview, and there are links to more information from within there. Any questions or comments here? All right, let's move on. All right, so I did not attend the full call, but I attended a portion of an an ONC developer roundtable yesterday, and it was quite interesting. The portions that I attended were focused on guidance and updates about API certification and real world testing requirements. And there were definitely some interesting takeaways. One thing that they explicitly talked about was, as we mentioned earlier, and as we've talked about many times, while US Core is the sort of the designated substitute for US CDI when you're using FHIR, there's no one-to-one mapping, and there are definitely differences. So one thing that they explicitly pointed out was that when US Core either requires data to be present or requires that a particular data element or property must be supported, when you're getting your product certified against US CDI 1 via FHIR, you have to comply with the US Core requirements, even if those particular data elements are not required in US CDI version 1. So even though technically what you're getting is technically the requirement is Fire version 4 to USCDI version 1, with a minimum data set of USCDI version 1. The actual requirement in reality for certification is meeting the US core, is US core compliance for the US core version that is considered functionally equivalent to USCDI version 1. And there, but so when there are differences, you actually the US core wins because that's what's valid in Fire. So I thought that was an interesting point to make. They also, several of these came from questions they got from people. So that was also kind of interesting because clearly there was some sense of, well, by the letter of the law, so to speak, I might be doing what I think the letter of the law requires, but I'm not meeting the spirit of it. This next one is also in that category, because presumably they either were asked about this or people tried to do this and failed. But there's something called a data reason absent extension that can be put on a property, which instead of giving the property an actual value, explains why there's no data there. And if a property must be supported according to US core, you can't, using this data reason absent extension is not sufficient for conforming to the certification requirement. You must have, that must support property, must be capable of containing real data. So, that sounds a little bit like a no-brainer, but clearly some people were trying to do that or they wouldn't have mentioned it. Another thing that was interesting is that they were talking a little bit about search requirements, and they pointed out that apparently earlier versions of the test harness did not support this, but it is valid and it's now supported in the test harness. It is, if someone requests some Fire resources via search, you have to return what the search results, but you can return some additional relevant data that you think is pertinent without it being explicitly requested. And the example that particularly came up was provenance. So if someone requests a bunch of encounter data, you can include the related provenance resources without them being explicitly requested. So I thought that was kind of interesting because, first of all, if you're not expecting them, then you may not know what to do with them. But also, the fact that they actually adjusted the test harness to support that was interesting. So apparently it was a frequent enough request that people wanted to do that they made a change to what they were testing in the conformance testing. And then the last one, this is something we've talked about before, but they actually went a little bit stronger on this than they have in the past. One of the requirements for this December 31st, 2022 supporting Fire with USCDI version 1 is also that the certified health IT developers have to publish the base URLs. That's the sort of the basically the endpoint addresses for all of the certified modules that can be used by patients to access their data. And that's true whether it's in a hosted environment or an environment that's installed locally at one of their customers. That part we've talked about before. But what actually, they went a step further yesterday and they actually explicitly implied, no, they did not explicitly, they implied fairly strongly without explicitly stating that not doing so very likely, I don't know if they went so far as very likely. They implied that if you don't do that, you could be considered to be information blocking. Let's put it at that. Let's put it like that. They were very careful about the language they used, but they went much further along that path than they have in the past. So I thought that was kind of telling. So not making the endpoint, if the vendors don't publish all of the endpoints for all of their customers using these modules, then that in of itself could be an information blocking violation. Anyone want to comment on any of that? Have any questions? No? All right, well then I believe if you'll go to the next slide. That concludes the quick updates for this week. I hope you learned a lot. If you're interested in finding more about the DGC and its other activities, please email me at dgc@mahealthdata.org. That email address is on your screen right now. And thank you very much for joining us.